All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor here at Rice University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Erik Peterson from Dartmouth College. His talk is entitled Demand Effects in Survey Experiments and Empirical Assessment, and this is joint work with Jonathan Mumolo. Erik's talk will last about 45 minutes. I'm sorry, about between 30 and 40 minutes. I apologize for that. After which point he will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. You may ask any questions at any time during the talk, but all questions will be held until the end of the presentation. So feel free to ask questions as they come up if you want, but they'll be handled at the end of the talk. A link to Erik's paper and slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the prepresentation, and I will post those links right after we get started. Now I'd like to welcome Erik Peterson to the IMC. Erik, welcome.
Thanks, Justin. So today, Jonathan and I are looking at a widespread concern facing researchers that use experimental approaches of all types, but in particular, survey experiments. And so the concern is that in the course of taking a study, people who are responding to it are able to infer what an experiment's up to. So they get some sort of cue, whether it's information that's provided to them during the recruitment or at the start of the study, or a cue they get while they interact with the researcher during it, if it's a lab experiment, and they figure out what's going on. And that as a result, they respond in a way that helps to confirm researcher expectations. So people in these studies want to help the researcher out, they're good subjects, and when they figure out what we're doing, they try to make it happen. So this is a potentially widespread concern facing all types of experimental research. And it's very problematic because for any set of research findings that we get, it's possible to construct some sort of artifactual demand effect style explanation for what we find. So instead of it being a real substantive response that tells us something about public opinion formation, political communication, how people evaluate political candidates, instead, basically what we're learning is that the people in these studies can figure out what we're up to and try to help us out. This is an especially concern as experiments become more prevalent throughout the social sciences more broadly, but in particular political science. So as we move towards more experimental research, the potential for this type of artifact to undermine what we know about politics gets bigger and bigger. And so in this study, what Jonathan and I are attempting to do is offer some empirical evidence of how concerned we should be about demand effects. And so in particular, we assess these in the context of online survey experiments. So this is a pretty widespread area of research. A lot of experimentation has moved online because it offers large subject pools and a lower cost relative to other means of doing so. But this raises potential concerns that these demand effects are present, especially among the types of populations that we can get to online. To get at this concern and offer some evidence of whether this is actually changing the types of things that we find in our studies, we use a new research design in which we randomly assign information about our expectations before we conduct a series of common experimental designs drawn from American politics, international relations, and comparative politics literatures. So the idea is to create a best case scenario for demand effect type behavior to occur, one in which we fully lay our cards on the table and tell the respondents in these studies what we expect them to do, and then go back and look and compare the people who've been informed about experimenter intent to the people who engage in just a typical survey, just a common experiment where they aren't offered this kind of information before doing it, and see if it changes the results. And so we think this offers a potential insight and research design to get at these types of demand effect concerns, which is to create the best case scenario for them to happen and see if it changes what we find out in these types of studies. And in particular, for this study, we're kind of looking at a best case scenario for demand effect style behavior to occur by conducting all the studies I'll be talking about on Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And so the particular concerns here are that even relative to student samples or other types of online subject pools, people on Mechanical Turk, where a lot of survey experimental research is being conducted, are potentially very prone to exhibit these types of demand effects. They're experienced, so many of them take a number of different social science studies, and so that might make them better at figuring out what we're up to in these studies. And there's also this employer-employee relationship that exists on Mechanical Turk. And so we call them Mechanical Turk workers. If you've interacted with them in any studies, they're often very concerned with their performance and how they're doing. And so as a result, these kind of forces make it seem like Mechanical Turk would be especially prone to this type of concerning demand effect type behavior. And so by looking at it here, it gives us the case to kind of see the worst potential case for demand effects. So to overview kind of our core findings from this, the first is that with respect to subjects figuring out what's happening in these studies, we actually find relatively diffuse beliefs about experimenter intent. So we ask a post-treatment question of everyone in these studies about what they thought the experiment was about. It's a closed choice option. There's 6 or 7 response options available. And so people in the control group here who don't find out any information about experimenter intent, only about 35% of them were able to correctly guess the experiment's purpose across the different studies we conduct here. So in many cases, it seems like even among these experienced survey takers on Mechanical Turk, they might not be fully aware of what's actually being examined, the types of hypotheses we're testing in these survey experiments. Moving beyond this to the effects of this information we provide, we show that offering up this information about what our intentions are before conducting the study does increase people's awareness about what the goal of the study is. So this is kind of a manipulation check showing that offering up this information does make people more aware of what's happening. However, at the same time, when we go back and compare the types of treatment effects we get in the groups that were informed about the study's purpose relative to what we would find in just the vanilla original replication of prior work, we don't see any changes in these results across the different studies we conduct. So we're largely finding similarly sized treatment effects. This isn't changing what we find, even in this condition where we create a situation where demand effects seem especially prone to occur. So moving beyond just providing information, kind of our last attempt to create these best case scenarios is not only to offer up information to people about our intent, but in 2 studies I'll talk about at the end, to offer them incentives, such that if they behave in a manner consistent with our expectations, they get an incentive. And so only when we create this very artificial setting where subjects are told exactly what we're doing and they're offered an incentive to behave along those lines, do we observe any sort of behavior that could be construed as consistent with demand effects. So we take this overall as evidence that outside of these artificial settings where we really work to induce demand effect type behavior, this actually suggests there's limited evidence that demand effects are threatening the validity of these online survey experiments. So this isn't to absolve any sort of other issues that these types of online survey experiments might have, but it does point to one big concern, something that often comes up in reviews or in the seminar room, and something that researchers take a variety of efforts to avoid, for example, by including deception at the start of a study. It suggests that these types of concerns about demand effects are overstated when we actually go back and try and create conditions for them to change the results. So I'll start just by offering a little bit of a background on demand effects and the concerns in the social sciences. And so this concern comes out of social psychology studies, especially those conducted in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So to kind of fix what this looks like, here's kind of the classic social psychology study of this era. People are recruited, typically students who are around campus. They enter some kind of waiting room, are offered up basic information about a study, and then they go into the main room where, in this case, a research assistant in a white lab coat is going to inform them about what will happen. So their engagement with the research assistant is now in person, and they're told instructions about what's going to happen in the study. And then they go on to respond, and we measure different outcomes that we care about. And so the concern that came out of these types of studies is that at some point in this process, the people who are participating in the study figure out what's going on. Either it's the information in a study recruitment pamphlet that lets them know the topic of the study, some sort of cue they get from the research assistant about what they're supposed to be doing in the study, or just how they interact with them. But they start to develop an idea about what behavior looks like, what behavior is expected of them here. And moreover, once they develop this idea about what researchers expect of them, they then go out of their way to make this happen. So they want to be good subjects, help science. And so as a result, when they figure out what they think the researcher wants them to do, they start to behave in that manner. And so this creates this artificial explanation where supportive experimental evidence from a survey is not evidence of kind of real theories about these different relationships that we're finding. Instead, it's an artifact, and it's an artifact where of people becoming aware of the experimenter's intent and good subjects acting consistent with this intent. And so, as I mentioned before, this is a very damaging concern to all types of experimentation because you can pretty much construct a demand effect style explanation for almost any pattern of experimental results you might find. So this potentially undercuts a wide swath of social science. These concerns, although they emerged in this laboratory setting, have translated pretty directly into online survey research. And so I think in a very influential case, Brinsky, Huber, and Lenz go and validate Mechanical Turk as a research tool for conducting social science experiments. But even here, when they have pretty reasonable results overall that suggest MTurk as a good platform for conducting these types of studies, at the end they have this caveat where they mention that there's an important need to disguise the intentions of these studies on Mechanical Turk because MTurk respondents may also exhibit experimental demand effect characteristics to a greater extent than respondents in other subject pools, divining the experimenter's intent and behaving accordingly. So these demand effects are a long-running concern in social science, but at least this recent argument is that we actually need to take them even more seriously for the types of online survey experiments that we're commonly conducting today. The point of departure for Jonathan and I here is to start to think about, is this actually a concern? And while we do have these concerns that people who are involved in online experimentation might be more responsive to experimenter demand if they can figure it out, there's also a variety of factors. If you look back to people theorizing about when and where they expect demand effects to occur in this laboratory psychology literature, that suggest actually we're in a good setting for avoiding demand effects. And so the first of these is that the types of online survey experiments we're studying here and that many researchers conduct are considered to be automated experiments in this older parlance. So what that means is, in contrast to that laboratory study I showed you, where people enter and have all sorts of direct interactions with the researcher or researcher assistants, in these automated experiments, all their interactions are conducted through a survey platform. And so this limits one potentially valuable channel that subjects might have to figure out what's going on, these types of interpersonal interactions, because instead they're engaging with a survey tool. They don't have these cues to go off of. So it makes it more difficult potentially in that respect for them to figure out what's happening. A second point is that the demand effects story assumes that the people in these studies want to be good subjects. That is, if they figure out what's happening, they really want to go out of their way to help make it happen for the researcher. We don't really have a great deal of evidence about what the distribution of different traits is among our respondents, but different work that's been conducted often suggests that respondents would be either indifferent or actively negativistic, so they might attempt to undermine what they expect the behavior is if they figure it out. And so this good subject response might be more diluted than we think, especially if they comprise only a small share of our survey population. And a final point is that in many of the types of experimental studies that are conducted nowadays, it's actually a pretty complicated story for demand effects to occur. So subjects need to decipher what's happening while they're involved in a longer survey instrument, so realize what parts are randomized, what parts aren't. They need to realize what condition they're in, and they need to alter their behavior accordingly so as to help get across whatever theory they think is being tested. In many cases, this is complicated. You can think about conjoint experiments conducted in online settings now that embed a variety of different types of information that are randomized. It's often difficult to tell what the key variable here is for a researcher. And so we think for all these reasons, there's potential countervailing forces that might make demand effects of relatively limited concern in online survey experiments. However, there is this kind of competing set of expectations. And so our goal here is to offer some new empirical evidence using a research design that allows us to assess these demand effects. So a lot of the discussion has been focused on kind of qualitative accounts in which subjects figure out what's happening and then behave accordingly. But we don't really know at a broader level if this actually changes the types of things that we would find in these studies. So our key contribution here is to introduce a research design to empirically assess demand effects. And so what we do across a common set of experiments is we pick a variety of different experimental designs, and I'll talk about more of those later, and we replicate them. So we take these common survey experiments that have previously been conducted in online settings, and we replicate them, with the addition that before the replication, we randomly assign some of the subjects information about our expectations. So we essentially tell them what's expected of them in this study. The idea being that offering up this information to subjects, especially on Mechanical Turk, creates this very good scenario for demand effects to alter what we find. We're kind of removing any sort of concerns that people aren't always aware of what's happening in these studies and amping that up as much as possible. And then the benefit of this is we can go back and assess differences in the treatment effects in these main studies. So when we compare people who were offered this information up to those who were not offered this information, do we actually get different findings? And this allows us to kind of benchmark how demand effects might be shaping the types of results we get in these platforms. So here's one example of a study we'll replicate here, and just to kind of introduce this overall approach to looking at demand effects. So this is a great paper by Tom Nelson, Rosalie Clausen, and Zoe Oxley, looking at media framing and its impact on support for civil liberties. So the theory that's being tested here is that providing a frame that emphasizes free speech will make people more supportive of allowing a hate group to conduct a rally. So emphasizing that the First Amendment's important, there's important free speech considerations at stake with allowing even groups that are disliked to hold political demonstrations. The idea is that this will increase support for these types of rallies, for allowing them to happen. And so it also is important because this is a pretty simple and common experimental design. So there's two conditions. Individuals receive this frame or don't receive this frame, so relatively simple in that respect. And it's testing this political communication theory, which a variety of different online experiments get at. So the idea about different forms of issue framing. So the question at stake here is, does this free speech frame increase tolerance for a hate group rally? In the original experiment, respondents were randomly assigned to receive either the free speech frame or no frame, and then there's an outcome measure afterwards assessing their support for allowing this rally to happen. And then our change here is that prior to conducting this replication, we randomly assign information about the expectations to people participating. So half of the sample received this information before they conducted the study, in which we tell them the purpose of this is so we can measure whether highlighting freedom of speech makes people more tolerant of controversial groups in society. So we kind of state experimenter intent to half of the sample. Everyone then goes on to complete this experiment in the standard fashion, and we can then see if this changes the types of results we get. So we implemented this overall experimental design in 3 different studies conducted on Mechanical Turk. Across all 3 of these studies, we have 4,900 responses, roughly. And in each of these studies, we conducted 2 experiments. And so they're drawn from this table below. The intent here is to get at a variety of different common research designs that are conducted in these online settings, and also spread across different substantive areas. So the first topic is that issue framing study I just walked you through. We also look at partisan selective exposure, so mimicking a study by Iyengar and Hahn, looking at whether people are more likely to select news articles if they have a co-partisan source label attached. We modify a broad class of experiments which look at the effects of providing information about an individual's race through their name on different outcomes. By having an experiment where people evaluate resumes and randomly assigning either white or black names for them to otherwise similar resumes and seeing if that changes people's assessment of those job candidates. And then moving outside of this kind of American politics setting, we also look at comparative politics experiment, so support for welfare. So whether the information that's provided about an individual receiving welfare can change people's support for that. And then an experiment from international relations, so looking at the democratic piece. So when a country is randomly assigned as either a democracy or a non-democracy, does that change people's willingness to support intervention in that country? And so this gets at a broad class of influential experiments. And what we'll do is see if the results in these experiments will be different in this setting where we really amp up the conditions for demand effects to occur. So to the first point, a kind of a core aspect of this demand effect account is that people in these studies are very good at figuring out what we're up to. And to offer some information about how good people are at this in just a baseline sense, what I'm showing you here are the percent of respondents in the control condition. So they received no information about experimenter intent. How effectively they can pick out the expectation, the intent of the experiment from a closed choice list with 6 or 7 other options after they participate in the experiment. So as you can see here, the framing example is the highest level of support. Just under 50% of people there are able to pick out the framing hypothesis from this list, even when they're offered no other information. But across these studies, many people have difficulty figuring out what exactly is being examined here. So in contrast to a view where mechanical Turk respondents are able to quickly diagnose what a study is about and figure out what's happening there, we actually see that in many cases they have some difficulty figuring out what's happening. And these are in many ways simple experiments for this to happen. So these all have 2 conditions. There's not a lot else going on in the studies. And even in this setting, where it might be somewhat easy for people to diagnose what's happening in these studies, mechanical Turk respondents who aren't offered up this information, on average about 35% of them are able to correctly figure it out. So this is certainly not the case that the entire sample knows what's happening. So moving beyond this to our experimental results, kind of a first stage manipulation check to see if this research design works is when we offer up this information about our expectations, does this actually increase people's awareness of them in that post-treatment measure? So what I'll show you here is the change in the probability that a respondent was able to correctly guess an experiment's purpose based on being provided this information directly relative to those who were in that control group and didn't receive this information. And I'll break this out for each of the different studies that are included here. So as you can see, across these different studies, we see at a minimum about a 10 percentage point increase in people's awareness of experimenter intent based on providing this information, and then all the way up to just over 20 percentage point increase for that resume study. So when we're offering this information up to people, it is effectively increasing what they are aware of about experimenter intent. And so this is creating very favorable conditions for demand effect behavior to occur. We've removed any sort of doubt about what the experiment's up to and greatly increased the share of the sample that knows what's happening in these studies. So kind of our core focus here is whether this would change the findings we get from these common experimental designs. So what I'll show you here is how this changes, how providing this information alters the baseline treatment effect in the main studies. So in all these cases, it's a dichotomous treatment, and they're scaled so that the treatment effect is expected to move in a positive direction. And we use the original outcome measures for each of these studies, but for comparison purposes, for what I'm showing you here, we've rescaled all of those to be between 0 and 1 if they were not already a binary measure. And so as you can see here, we replicate many of these prior studies in finding that in the baseline study where we're looking at the effect of treatment, it's changing people's attitudes or behaviors. So for instance, in the framing study included at the top here, that shift providing the free speech frame relative to no frame produces this increase in support for allowing the hate group rally to occur, as it does in the original study. In the new studies, offering a co-partisan source relative to a neutral or out-partisan source increases the probability individuals select a news article to read. In the democratic peace study, making a country a non-democracy relative to a democracy increases people's willingness to use force against that country. And finally, in the welfare experiment, portraying a welfare recipient as lazy rather than unlucky increases support for restricting access to welfare. So overall, a pretty standard set of results. We're looking at these studies that have been conducted before and finding pretty similar things in these baseline conditions that are essentially how they were conducted before. So what I'll show you next is the baseline treatment effect for the conditions where we provided information to respondents, so where we really amped up the potential prospects for demand effects to occur. And so now those points are all displayed as the second element in each of these. And so what you can see here is that overall, despite greatly increasing awareness about experimenter intent among individuals in these information conditions, we observe largely similar findings across these different studies in terms of the treatment effects, the key results we get. So for the frame, the first news study, we see slightly smaller ones. In some cases, they're slightly larger, as in the resume study or the welfare study. But if we look at this with kind of the key outcome here, which is the difference in difference. So how does the treatment effect look different in the information condition relative to the baseline condition? We see that there's no case where we observe a statistically significant increase in the treatment effect in those conditions where we offered information up to respondents. And so under a demand effect story, where people behave so as to confirm researcher hypotheses, we would expect these to all be positive. We'd greatly inflate treatment effects when we give this information to people. But actually what we see here is very small point estimates that are close to zero, or in the case of the first news experiment, actually negative. And in no case is there a statistically significant difference where the results of the treatment effects are different than they were in the no information study. So this first treatment was just offering up information of any type to these respondents. We don't know exactly what the distribution of good, neutral, or negativistic subjects in the study is, but we do know that offering up this information didn't change behavior. So as a final cut in attempting to look at what are the best case scenarios for this type of demand effect behavior to occur, we experiment with a additional condition in which not only do we offer people information about what the expectation is in a study, but we now align their incentives with the researchers by offering an incentive. So in this case, there's an additional incentive condition in this third study we conducted, where people now are informed about the researcher intent in the study, and they're offered 25 cents if their behavior in the subsequent experiment is consistent with these expectations. So the idea here is we remove that potential channel where subjects might understand what's happening when they are offered this information and just not want to help researchers by actually bringing it, making it in their interest to behave in ways that's consistent with the expectations they've just learned about. So this is a very artificial scenario. This is obviously something that's not conducted in typical studies. People aren't informed about these conditions at all, and they certainly aren't offered incentives based on their behavior that would align with researcher expectations. What we're trying to do is understand what are the upper bounds of what demand effects could look like here. And so, as I mentioned, this was available in just the third study. So this is for the democratic peace and welfare experiments. What I'm showing you here were those results broken out from the last figure. So here's the treatment effects in the baseline condition, where it was the standard replication. We offered no additional information to respondents. And then the treatment conditions in the information condition. So these are the people who were just informed what experimenter intent was in each of these cases. In this last box, which I'll fill in here, is what do these treatment effects look like in these incentive conditions, where not only are people informed about the purpose of the experiment, it's now in their interest to act in ways consistent with this demand effect theory. So as you can see here, there's a noticeable jump on the treatment effect in the democratic peace experiment, and a much smaller one in the welfare experiment. In both cases, this is behavior that's consistent with demand effects. So we're seeing larger treatment effects. These are helping the researcher out in this condition where we offer incentives. And so for the democratic peace experiment, the difference in difference, our key focus here, the treatment effect in the incentive group is statistically significantly larger than the treatment effect in the baseline group. For the incentive condition, the point estimate is positive, but again, it's not statistically significant from zero, so it's pretty close to what you get just from providing information. So we view this as kind of a very artificial but strong dose of creating these conditions for demand effects. And even here, the information isn't doing it. It's just that example from the democratic peace study where if we offer additional incentives beyond just the baseline information, we see a larger treatment effect. So it does appear like there's some behavior consistent with demand effects there. So just to kind of recap our key findings from this study, overall, we take this as relatively limited evidence that demand effects are undermining common survey experimental research designs. So we've gone out of our way to create a best case scenario for demand effects to occur by directly informing people about what's happening. and conducting this on a platform where demand effects are thought to be especially likely to occur. But even here, we find limited support for kind of the two core tenets of the demand effect story. So the first of these is that respondents are able to diagnose an experiment and figure out the experiment's purpose in a relatively easy manner. So just our baseline evidence about these control groups here shows that many respondents, even on Mechanical Turk, have difficulty in doing so. So there's relatively diffuse beliefs about experimenter intent on these platforms, even with the kind of simple experimental designs we conducted here. So to the first point, we showed difficulty for people to infer an experiment's purpose. And to the second point, that when people figure this out, they will act so as to confirm researcher expectations. We have evidence that isn't very supportive of this. So we show that information alone fails to change the experimental results in a number of common studies. So across these different research designs, simply offering people information about researcher expectations doesn't lead us to come to a different conclusion than we would in kind of the standard vanilla experiments that are typically conducted where we aren't going out of our way to tell people what's happening. And the only case where we're able to observe this demand effect consistent behavior is in a relatively artificial setting. So in this case, it's when information is paired with incentives, something that doesn't really happen in any sort of common studies, but is useful here as kind of this theoretical upper limit for what demand effects might look like. And even here, we find evidence that, yes, in this artificial condition, there's potentially inflated experimenter demand in that democratic P study, but it doesn't really change things in that welfare study. So this is the start of the paper. We're hoping to expand it, and definitely interested to hear questions that people have coming up. So just to provide some context, we're going to conduct more of these incentive-based studies, and especially start to look at survey platforms other than Qualtrics to see how this generalizes. But yeah, thanks for watching, and excited to hear any questions people have.
Okay, Erik, thank you for that presentation. At this point, Erik Peterson is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I have a couple of questions. So I'm going to start with I think we used to call them anecdotes. Now we call them vignettes. So I'm teaching research methods in my undergrad class now, and I wanted to show them some, what experiments look like. And so I did the old resume experiment, which I think is similar to, it wasn't a duplication of the one you did, I think, but it's a very similar kind of study where you change the name on the resume from something like J. Smith to Jamal Smith. And then you look at basically how people assess their qualifications. And in the original experiment, you see whether you hire them. And of course, we didn't have a real job, so I just had them assess qualification. Mm-hmm. And I found, I actually got the data from my class and found absolutely no effect at all. Mm-hmm. And I said to the class, what do you think happened? And we were talking about it. And one thing I asked them was, how many of you had heard of this study? And almost everyone raised their hand. And I was like, well, okay. I mean, you knew what you were supposed to do, right? Or not supposed to do in this case. You were aware of your bias, and potentially maybe you sort of corrected it. And so I thought that was a case where it wasn't exactly experimenter incentives. It wasn't that they knew what I wanted to do, but they did know what I was looking at, right? They knew what I was thinking about. And the effect went to zero. And that kind of makes sense, because if you tell people, oh, you need to watch out for this bias, they react to that. So this is leading to a question. I'm not just talking. The question is, are some experiments more susceptible to this than others, right? I'm thinking of particularly like these resume type experiments, or experiments that make people aware of biases.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about the resume experiments starting to perform differently. So actually, in our case, the baseline experiment was also a null.
Right, I saw that.
That speaks to kind of this broad, awareness of those types of studies. I think there's probably variation on that. In this case, we did a variety of relatively simple experimental designs. So these are often just kind of A/B experiments. So you get a block of text that's the supported free speech frame, or you don't. In the resume experiment, where it's the name is shifting, in the news experiment, it's a news article shifting. So there's really not a lot of moving parts here, which would, at the outset, was kind of our thought was be to start out with these simple designs and potentially identify or diagnose demand effects, and then move on to more complicated ones to show what kind of measures you would need to avoid them. But actually what we find is even in these relatively simple designs, we aren't getting a ton of demand effect consistent behavior. But to that point, I would say if we are having difficulty doing it here, I think it becomes even harder to do, for instance, in some sort of, more complicated experimental design, like a conjoint where there's 4 or 5 different attributes that vary. It's tougher to pick out what exactly is important there, or even in other studies where there's a vignette and you're moving around a couple different parts and they might always not be aware. I think in terms of variation by experimental design, I think we certainly thought it was going to be easier in some rather than others, and just even in these relatively simple designs aren't seeing this as a big problem. But
you mentioned social psych as an inspiration for this, and I think there's a lot that you've seen already. There's a lot of variation in the replicability of social psych experiments. Some are pretty resilient, some are not, and in particular, the priming experiments have been they've had a lot of trouble replicating some of those findings. And I'm thinking it might be because those findings are so sensitive, right? They're not really strong effects. And so just a little push here and there can cause these changes. That could be considerably different. I'm looking at your examples. Most of them don't seem to be necessarily those kind of like really sensitive sort of almost mood-based reactions.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the kind of two competing explanations for the replication crisis is one, I think to your point, that there's very subtle things you have to do to bring them about. And the other is that it's just it's just hard to implement those types of studies. There's a lot of interaction with research subjects involved. You have to train research assistants to do it. And there's just a high degree of difficulty. So I think part of the reason we had pretty good success replicating here. And I think across the literature, if you look at things like issue framing in the political science studies, they replicate reasonably well because it is a much more standardized, automated way of conducting these treatments. There's kind of less discretion and a need for very detailed plans for how you implement the experiments because it's much more simple to do, I think.
I mean, one thing I noticed that's not on here, there's a whole literature on, a huge literature on behavioral economics and experimental economics type studies where there are you're playing a game usually, and that's we worry. I've done some of those in the past, and we do worry a little bit about tipping them what we want them to do, trying to avoid tipping them what we want them to do. But in that case, there are actually institutional forces that's what we're really interested in studying. And one would think those would be a lot less susceptible to demand effects than something like, some sort of minor cue in the environment that might cause you to be slightly more or less inclined to do something.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. So there is, if this was in the NBER bulletin, I think this would have been last year at some point. There is a paper that's starting to look at those in kind of the incentive compatible games. And I think if I remember right, they do find a little bit of evidence that there are some demand effect type behaviors. So our focus was just on these kind of political attitude or behavior studies. But I do think, there's potential for things to change in the incentive games. By the same token, though, in those games, people benefit from, or there's usually some incentive for people to behave in a way that there's an incentive compatible behavior. So that if that goes against researcher expectations, we don't certainly have evidence here that people seem to want to give up stuff to help the researcher.
I want to ask you about, this is, for those of you who have the slides open, this is slide, it's page 18, and then it also says 41 of 63. I'm not sure which that counts as. But this is about awareness of experimenter intent. Mm-hmm. And in this slide, in the next few slides, it was really sort of interesting to me, first of all, that a fair number of people were able to guess, right? So that means the effect that the actual treated group that you were able to affect with your experiment doesn't include these people, right? Because these people are always treated. And then the marginal increase in treatment in awareness is relatively small. Mm-hmm. So you've got a relatively small group of people that you're really they're in an instrumental variable sense, they're the people you're instrumenting, right? They're the people that have actually been affected. And first of all, that's weird, right? It seems like you almost have two groups: the people who already know and the people who don't care, or the people who just absolutely can't figure it out, which is bizarre. And first of all, I just want to ask about that. But then the second thing is, maybe you're finding small effects because the people who already know have already basically changed their behavior, and everyone else, maybe they're mostly behaving randomly, or God, who knows what they're doing, right? Who knows? They can't, if they can't take it, when you tell them this is what I want and they don't understand that, I don't even know what they're doing at that point.
Yeah, I think it's, some of it is our typical concern in these online settings, which is very different from the demand effect concern, is people don't pay enough attention or they move too quickly through these things. So to the extent we don't observe everyone shifting into knowing what's going on in these conditions where you offer this information, I'd say it's more consistent with those types of concerns being something to worry about in a survey experiment, rather than overly attentive people uptaking too much information and acting on it. So I think I was surprised as well, especially in the incentive conditions, that we didn't get very quick switches. Or very large switches in behavior in those studies. And I think it speaks to, one, people are just kind of going through these surveys. There might be some inattention that's baked in no matter what. And two, even when this information is offered up, it's short of telling people exactly what we want them to do. So like, if in this group you need to do this, there is still a bridge they have to cross if they figure it out, for trying to map their behavior, and which is kind of difficult, even in a simple experimental study. They have to figure out exactly what that means for them to be in the co-partisan news group relative to the out-partisan news group. Would they have picked the news story either way because it's a topic they like or something? So I do think it becomes a little complicated, even in that scenario, for people to reason it out. So I think that's part of the explanation here. To your point about a substantial portion or a decent portion of the sample kind of being always knowers. So they're people who just they're the best at this. They can figure things out. There's a supplementary analysis I'll move to here. It's a little underpowered, so we're hoping to conduct more studies that will get this a little more well-powered. But the idea is that since we conduct 2 studies in each of these experiments, we can look at people in the control group of study 1 who got things right. So this portion of the survey population that's really good at guessing what survey is about. And then we can go on to look at their behavior in the second study. And so if it's the case that these types of people who can guess correctly are prominent contributors to the treatment effects we ultimately get, so every time they're in a study, they're able to diagnose it and act in a way that helps the researcher out, we'd expect the treatment effects among this guessing group to be much larger than they would be among people who have difficulty figuring this out. So what I'm showing you here is a model where we interact treatment across these studies. We have study fixed effects included, with whether people, and this is in the second study, we interact that with whether they were able to correctly guess study 1. So the idea here is to isolate the treatment effect among these always guessers versus the treatment effect among people who couldn't get it right in the first study. And so kind of the key coefficient of interest here is the last row, where we see that there's actually not that large of a difference in the treatment effects in these studies among people who are able to guess correctly relative to people who don't. So I think that gets at part of the question of are these people who are always able to figure it out driving experimental results? But again, this is a little harder to test, and so we're hoping to accumulate some more evidence on these types of people and if their treatment effects among them vary substantially from people who aren't able to guess what a study's about.
Do you think that these the sort of lack of uptake in when you basically gave them the information about what you wanted, do you think that says anything or has any bearing on how we should think about empiric experiments relative to traditional surveys or laboratory experiments or something else?
Yeah, I mean, not having the comparison group for how this would look in a lab setting, it's unclear. I mean, I think the expectation is that people often pay more attention in those settings. They've gone out of their way to come to the psychology lab to be involved in them, and they sit there for some set amount of time and can look over the instructions. At the same point in time, I think a lot of the theorizing about what online respondents, especially MTurkers, are like, points to them having very high degree of attention. in other aspects of these studies. So, for example, being able to figure out if there's some sort of attention check embedded in them, things like that. It's tough to say if it would be larger with a different survey population and potentially easier to manipulate. Just because in a lot of senses, we think the kind of people on MTRK are very attentive survey takers relative to someone who's required to take a study for psych credit or something like that.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different group among those psych experiments who are basically just undergrad captive audience versus behavioral economics. You generally recruit, you don't require, you recruit and then you pay them. That's a different, yeah. Okay, well, not seeing any further questions, I'll go ahead and end a little bit early. First of all, I want to thank Erik for giving the talk this week. Second, I also want to say his presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to share the presentation with someone else or watch it again later. I also want to announce next week, Friday, March 9th, we will host a talk from Casey Chrisman Cox at Washington University of St. Louis. His talk is entitled Estimating Signaling Games in International Relations, Problems and Solutions. And this is co-authored work with Michael Gibalisco at Caltech. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Erik, thanks for giving the talk this week.
Thank you.
All right, and I'll hope to see everyone next week.